Anyway, this is a special edition of The Miracle Within, and I am looking at chapter 20 in A Course in Miracles, which is an entire chapter devoted to the activities of Jesus on the event of his death. We are back with the book, A Course in Miracles, and we are looking at the illusion of death and how Jesus confronted it, because the whole story that we have in biblical account in the New Testament is pretty gruesome, pretty grisly. And we are given the idea in that story, hi Sonia, that Jesus was a sacrificial animal, and that God, the God of the Jews, demanded blood sacrifice. And a lot of people don't realize how dark that era was. But if you went back to the temple in Jerusalem on the eve of Jesus's passage through this world, the Palm Sunday event, and then the crucifixion event, and ultimately the resurrection, the temple in Jerusalem was really a slaughterhouse. You know, in order for you to atone for your sins, you had to show up with some kind of an animal or a bird or something to offer as a blood offering. Otherwise, the old version of God would smite you dead. So, and it wasn't always clear what you were doing to offend God. So, you know, if you read some of the stories in the Old Testament, it gets really, really grim. So that was the old law, and that was in place. And with the entire population of Israel making a pilgrimage periodically to the temple, there was a huge amount of commerce around selling animals to be slaughtered. And the temple was running day and night. People don't really have a clear picture of what it was like, but animals were having their heads lopped off and being stabbed, and you know, blood was pouring down in rivulets, and ultimately most of the meat ended up being cooked and distributed to the poor and that sort of thing. But nonetheless, the whole idea of a God who demands that something die in order to get him over his little ego attack is really pretty horrific when you stop and think about it. So Jesus comes along and develops a very personal relationship with God, an interactive one where he enters into communion with God randomly throughout the day. And, you know, that was a very interesting statement he made in, I think, 2 of the Gospels, if I remember correctly, where he ruminates, I die daily. And what that means is he dies to his ego in order to surrender himself to that perfect union with God. So Jesus comes along and discovers and expresses a whole different level of spirituality, something that's based on compassion, love, truth, and the glory of God. So it was quite a encounter 2,000 years ago when Jesus says, hey, God is love and God is life. And if you will stop being Joe or Mary or Bill and step out of your ego for a few minutes, you'll discover that you and God are one. And within that, you can experience the highest level of love comprehensible to man. You can experience life eternal and no longer identify yourself with this physical body that is highly vulnerable and is going to ultimately disintegrate. It's going to go away. So the faster we can put our attention and attunement on God, the faster we will lift ourselves up out of our personal egos and get out of that cycle of being born, living a life in strife and disharmony and confusion and fear and frustration, and arriving at a place where we realize, oh, I am not this physical body. I am an eternal being. And not only am I an eternal being, but I am perfect in every sense of the word. So that was really what Easter and the events at this season of the year were trying to reveal to us. So when Jesus came along and started his interaction with Helen Schuckman and Mr. Thetford, he was narrating A Course in Miracles and shares some very profound insights. And when we come up to chapter 20, he talks about the crucifixion, the resurrection, and all of the associated events that have become the cultural idioms of Christianity at its core. And unfortunately, Christianity as an organized religion, more often than not, fails to comprehend that the death was meaningless. The death was absolutely a non-event in the exact existence of Jesus, because he knew he was eternal. So when he allowed the body to be placed on that ugly position on the hill of Golgotha, right outside of Jerusalem, he allowed humanity to express and to vent all of the darkness and the fear that they had of God. And that really was the key to helping mankind understand that you don't have to do this, and there is only one thing that is holding you back from experiencing the truth of who you are, and that is the act of forgiveness. So as the events became more and more horrific, and he carried his own cross up the hill and allowed himself to be crucified, at that final moment when he transcended his body, he made that utterance, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." Now, how many Christians do you know who in the same position, instead of reacting on the level of God, come down here and kick everybody's ass, would be capable of making a statement so perfect and so pure and so vested in love that it became the eternal standard for those who are able to see through the veils of organized Christianity and arrive at a place where they understand what Christ is trying to do. So it's a very beautiful series of events when taken from the perspective of A Course in Miracles. And that's what we're hoping that everybody eventually will come to comprehend in their own unique way as soon as possible here on this little planet of misery and death and destruction. So starting off, the vision of holiness, Holy Week. And it starts a week ago, Palm Sunday. It says, this is Palm Sunday, the celebration of victory and the acceptance of the truth. So Jesus had, up to that point, been working on his own elevated thought. In other words, he went through the process of awakening himself, and he did it so perfectly that he overcame the entire illusion of the world. So on Palm Sunday, the actual day, the actual event, was his full enlightenment that was presented to us, where he rides victorious into the city, into the next stage of his spiritual advance. He says, let us not spend this Holy Week brooding on the crucifixion of God's Son, but happily in the celebration of his release. So release from what? Well, release from the illusion of death. That's what crucifixion is. It's the ugliest type of death that we could possibly imagine. Easter is a sign of peace, not pain. A slain Christ has no meaning. So, he's really making statements here that kind of level the ground and really pull us away from this idea of fear associated with God. And this is taking us away from that concept of God demanding blood, God demanding sacrifice, because those are not on God's agenda. A risen Christ becomes a symbol of the Son of God's forgiveness on himself. See, every time you go through that act of forgiveness, as Jesus did when he was on the cross and made that statement, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do," he was forgiving himself first, as well as all of the collective, because he knew that everybody in that crowd and that everybody on the planet that was undoubtedly feeling this shift in paradigm at that time. I think there had to have been some kind of a global consciousness dilemma, I guess you could say, for some lack of some other identifying thought. But in that space where he did this act of forgiveness of himself and humanity, all of humanity was given that option of being able to wake up from the illusion that had trapped them. So it really becomes more and more personal as you start to really look into the story of what Jesus was experiencing and how he was performing these acts on behalf of all of us, and how every time we forgive the slightest offense, it affects everybody on the planet. That is such a powerful concept. We know so little about the truth of the power of our capacity to forgive that we dismiss it. Oh, forgiving is, not necessary, or it's a sign of weakness, or it's a this, or it's a that. But that simple act of forgiveness that is presented to you on multiple occasions throughout the day, when you can walk away from conflict with a forgiving heart, a forgiving mind, has the ripple effect on everybody on the planet. Now, granted, you may not see that directly in the moment, but over the course of your lifetime, the more you practice these types of spiritual disciplines, the more you will begin to recognize that the world subtly has started to shift. It has become less hard, less dense. And there is a lightening that's going on. You begin to see things surrounded more by light, rather than seeing them isolated and polarized in this realm of darkness. So the Holy Week, that era between, or that period between Palm Sunday and the following Easter Sunday, which is Resurrection Sunday, is a period where the most powerful laws that exist were very firmly upheld by Jesus in that physical incarnation that created a religion. How about that? So it goes on to say, the sign he looks upon himself as healed and whole. So once you are able to forgive yourself and to forgive mankind, you're able to see yourself as you truly are. That's all it takes. You don't have to go to India and sit on a mountaintop and wait for enlightenment. You don't have to, set aside time every day to study these very profound thoughts and to be able to engage with people around you in these deep discussions about what the truth of life really is. All of those things are wonderful, but they're diversions. You know, you can have a good time with your spiritual journey, but at the same time, if you start to really focus on the point of it, you cut to the chase. And then all of a sudden, throughout the day, whenever you can bring yourself to a place of stillness and forgive every event, forgive every individual, forgive every circumstance that seems to be oppressing you, then you are going to lighten your own load, and you are going to accelerate on a upward curve that you probably can't even conceive of currently. So it really is, you know, Jesus as the way shower that is the foundation for A Course in Miracles, and is the foundation in truth for Christianity, what Christianity should be. I know personally from experience, I have friends and relatives who are Quaker, and Quaker is the only truly Christian organization that I have encountered that really puts into practice the laws of what Jesus was presenting to us, that came about as a result of his death and resurrection. So, you know, if you get a chance, go hang out with the Quakers some Sunday morning. It's a very profound experience. It's something you probably haven't experienced. But they enter into that conscious acceptance of a collective union with Jesus, and thereby with God. So you go to a Quaker service and they're quiet. They're just sitting there in their little church. But as you sit down and join them, you feel somehow that this barrier, this shell of who you are, has started to lighten up. And that's what we're all trying to do, is we're trying to get beyond this personal sense of self that is easily offended and that is murderous in its reaction to those offenses. You know, and you've got to admit, unless you've been on or dishonest with yourself, you know there is an element somewhere deep within you that is capable of the most horrific things imaginable, as an act of spite or as an act of revenge. And that's the ego. And that's what we're trying to identify and then slowly transmute, transform. See, we're not trying to eliminate the ego necessarily, because that will happen naturally on its own. All we're doing is trying to bring love into the ego. And the love of God is inexhaustible. The love of God is a purification process. And so we really are literally engaged in the journey of purifying our ego to the degree that at some point we just release it. It's just no longer there. So that's what we're doing with our Easter devotionals. That's what we're looking at as we hit this time of the year. For the Jews, Passover was the celebration of the Passover of the angel of death. Again, that association of death with God. And unfortunately, that was what had crippled the Jews in their personal evolution. You know, you have the mystical Judaic traditions, which goes far beyond the mechanics of the basic Judaic process. But all of the world's religions have that duality factor. There is a mystical aspect which gets us back to the act of love and rejoining God in that love. And then we have the other side of it, which is the punitive side, where man is being punished for all of his sins. And, you know, there's that very dark story in the Old Testament where the Ark of the Covenant was being transported and it was starting to wobble. And this one guy who was not a Levite pushed back, tried to steady it, and God struck him dead. And I remember when I was a small child, the first time I heard that story, I was like, wait, so God kills a guy who's trying to help God's people take God's possession, the Ark of the Covenant, and put it in a new placement. That somehow seems a little bit psychotic. So as we're able to separate truth from error, and as we're able to look beyond the duality and recognize the truth of what Jesus was attempting to express for us on our behalf, we begin to realize that all of these old fears of God were put in place by stories just like that. And that's the thing that gets us out of the forest, is to realize God is love itself. God is eternal life itself. So the idea of God coming along and striking somebody dead is so absurd that it's actually obscene. So Jesus was very much aware of that. And, in his personal journey, he arrived at the place where he forgave the entire world for all of its sins, because he knew that he was both the sinner as well as the ones being sinned against. So it was a very powerful period in human history. And whether you take the path of using Jesus as the Christ, the vehicle to discover the Christ and your own ascension beyond this realm, or you use Gautama Buddha, Siddhartha and the story of his transition to become the Buddha. It's all the same thing, and you'll find in essence the same stories peppered throughout cultures all over the world of man making a journey beyond his humanity and starting to step into his divinity. And that's actually, kind of an amazing thing. It really is. So going on to we've only started here with chapter 20, and already we've got we've managed to put in 25 minutes in just 3 sentences. So what does that tell you about this concept of Easter and rebirth and resurrection? It tells you that this is truth. It is the most powerful truth that humankind has ever known. So going on a little bit further down, it says this week begins with Palm Sunday, and ends with lilies. The following Sunday, Easter Sunday, and the resurrection. And the lily is a beautiful symbol of the return of life. It is the eternal symbol. Every spring, the lilies in various places around the world start to spring up. And these beautiful flowers are symbolic of the fact that God did not condemn anyone to death. God did not create death. We, in our silliness, in the absurdity of our belief that we had separated ourselves from God, simply by that act, created the idea of death. But death is not real. And once you really start to invest yourself in that, to realize that, your life takes on an entirely different texture. A lot of people remember 5 years ago when I literally died. I came down with pneumonia and croaked on the way to the hospital. Was put on a ventilator. I spent 6.5 days on a ventilator with no brain activity. And finally, the family was all gathered and they were all ready to say goodbye. And the doctors unplugged my little ventilator machine and I woke up. And I've spent the last 5 years really entrenching myself in A Course in Miracles. I had been studying it prior to that, but that specific event was a turning point for me. And it was absolute proof of the nothingness of death. Because those 6 days when I theoretically was dead is all blank. It was empty. I didn't wake up in this, waiting room outside the gates of heaven and meet my cousin from 28 years ago and the puppy dog that I first had when I was a child. I didn't have any of those experiences. It was blank, dark, nothing. And that really is what death is. See, we glorify death. We give it power. But the truth is, it's nothing. And then eventually we wake up and we go through the ride. We get on the bull. We open the gate. And we're, at the rodeo. We're getting bucked and humped and everything else. But at the conclusion of each lifetime, there is this falling into a place of nothingness, falling into something that is not real, where we just go asleep. We just go flatline. It's all black. There's nothing there. And then we wake up in a different body and we've forgotten about who we were. And so we develop a new personality and create the associated ego and climb the mountain and drink the wine and get ourselves into trouble all over again and then die. And Jesus came along during the week of Passover and said, you don't need to do this. You're just going through all of this, what you think is wonderful experiences in order to arrive at the threshold of death once again. And death, no matter how you die, is ugly. So in this lifetime, you go down to cancer. In your next lifetime, you get hit by a rocket. And the lifetime after that, you get your head chopped off by the neighbor. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's all ugly and unnecessary. And that's what the story of Easter and the story of the resurrection is all about. Jesus came into this world just in the same state as you or I. But he went through this powerful series of experiences of awakening. He never, anywhere in A Course in Miracles or in the Bible, said, you can't follow me. As a matter of fact, he constantly, throughout both the Course and in the Bible, said, you can do these miracles as well as I can. He very, very conscientiously did not separate himself and set himself apart. He was there as an awakened individual, calling the rest of us to take that next step toward our own awakening, to look death in the eye and rebuke it, to laugh at it, to know that it is nothingness. It is a blank, empty nothing. So we as eternal spiritual beings, and we as the vessels of God, within each of us, we carry an altar, and on that altar is the presence of God. We are sacred beings. So let Easter be a symbolic for you, not as the crucifixion and the cross. If you have a cross that you wear, you might want to think about maybe shifting that around. One of my favorite replacements for the image of the cross is the Jewish symbol, the Chai. And the Chai, C-H-A-I, means life. And that really is a symbol of what Easter is all about. It's not the blood and the gore and the thorns and the strife and the turmoil and the ugliness. It's about life, eternal, perfect. And you are that life. So look at this Easter Sunday with forgiving eyes, because the only way that you can actually start your own personal journey back to the truth of who you are is by forgiving everybody for everything they have ever done against you. Because that is, it has a loop effect. You're not forgiving them, you're forgiving yourself. Because you are not a victim of this world. You created the world that you inhabit. That's how powerful we are. We are spiritual beings with the power to create our life experience. So if you're looking around and observing chaos and unhappiness and misery and tears, ask yourself, why am I doing this? What is the point of my allowing my ego to take me down this road of destruction and turmoil and frustration when all I have to do is just let go? That's the only thing you have to do. Let go of your grievances. Let go of your enmity. Let go of your belief that somebody did something to you. Because ultimately, when the line is drawn in the sand, everything that we experience, we are doing to ourselves. So with the arrival of Easter, with the arrival of spring, with the arrival of the full moon and April 1st, it would behoove you to get into a posture where you are willing to humble the ego, put the ego on the cross instead of the Christ within you, and know that in truth, you are one with God through Christ, and Jesus will be the brother who shows up to help you on your journey if you select that, if you open yourself to that possibility. And I have felt the presence of Jesus on more than one occasion in my own life, sitting in the car beside me, going through really horrific situations where I most likely would have had this body mangled beyond reparation. So Jesus is always willing to join you on your journey. That's why the book was written, A Course in Miracles. So pick up the book, give it a spin. Pick up the idea of forgiveness and entertain it for a few days. See what happens. Pick up the idea of I am a divine being. I am not an ego. I am not separate from God. I and the Father am one. And I think you'll have a pretty amazing spring. I think you'll have a pretty amazing journey into the future. So may you all be blessed with this Easter event that we are at the threshold of. And know that on Good Friday, the illusion of Jesus's death was made very visceral 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem. But 3 days later, the tomb was rolled open, and the light that came forth was blinding. And then 40 days after that, after Jesus had spent time with his followers, he went to the next level of awakened consciousness. He transcended the body, stepped out of it, and went into that realm where there was light so brilliant and so bright that every sense of form was obliterated in that light. And that's where we're all headed together. So happy Easter. Get out there, share the love, pass the love around. And I will speak to you in less than a week. I'll be back on Wednesday this coming week. I skipped Wednesday this week so I could do the Friday event. So many blessings to you all, and know that the blood of Christ means nothing. It is the love of Christ, the joy of Christ, the forgiveness of Christ, and the acceptance of Christ that has meaning. Bye now.